Okay, so we are on Chesed Beis 8b. Begin the Gemara. The Mishnah yesterday opened with the statement, quoted all over, the Midash Adam Moedid, Bo Moedid and Loi, that God's attribute is measure for measure. The way in which the person behaves, the measure by which he measures his own life, is the measuring used to measure, to respond. We explained that at length yesterday what that means. And then the Mishnah gave an outline as to how the Sotah proceedings is a counteraction to her behavior. Very outline. We didn't go into much detail. We just had general outline. She tried to make herself beautiful for sin. So then the result is she's exposed and made to be unsightly, unseemly. She exposed herself for sin, so she gets exposed in the temple, physically her body. They rip her clothing. She began her sin with the thigh and then progressed to enjoying it in her stomach. And therefore the result is the rupture of the thigh and the stomach. That's what we had yesterday. Today in the Gemara is first going to broaden the statement and then come back to the Sotah and give us more detail. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yosef on Chesed Beis 8b, towards the bottom you see the big Gimel Mem Gemara, and there we are. Amar Rav Yosef said, Afagav de Mida Betela, even though the measure itself is no longer around, that is to say, the capital punishments and some of the corporal punishments that exist, specifically capital punishment, does not exist anymore because you don't have the high court that enables us to do capital punishment. But nonetheless, b'mida, Hashem gives distribution using his measure, like Batla doesn't stop yet. That hasn't stopped. So even though the human court no longer can dolly out capital punishment, but nonetheless, Hashem can. So the midah is no longer around. The measure itself that we have is no longer around. But b'midah, the fact that God responds in kind, measure for measure, that hasn't stopped yet. The Rav Yosef further stated, and the same thing was taught by Rabbi from the day that the temple was destroyed, even though the high court is no longer around, and therefore they cannot enforce capital punishment. But nonetheless, arba misas, the 4 different types of capital punishment that used to exist, that hasn't stopped. So the Gemara asks, the phrasing is interesting. You just finished saying that it's no longer around. So what do you mean that the capital punishment? You just finished saying that the Sanhedrin is gone, but the capital punishment isn't gone. Well, isn't the capital punishment linked to the Sanhedrin? If the Sanhedrin is no longer here, then the capital punishment is no longer here. In the phrasing, that's interesting. Rather, what we mean is din arba midos le'batlu. Hashem's judgment, the judgment of the four types of capital punishment are still around, even though the actual judgment, as it is here in this physical world, with human judges, that's no longer, because the Sanhedrin is no longer here, the high court's no longer here, because the temple is no longer here, and therefore a human being cannot inflict capital punishment, but the judgment from Hashem's capital punishment, that still exists. How so? So Mishin is chayiv schila, one who is liable for capital punishment, for which one would have been culpable for stoning. That's one of the 4 types of capital punishment, is the stoning. And as I mentioned a couple of classes ago, stoning, the way it used to be in Torah law, is the person was pushed off a high platform onto stone, and that hopefully the point was the person would die on impact, and if not, then stones would be thrown. But initially the person was pushed off of a large, off of a high platform onto stone that would hopefully give him a painless death.
Sort of like the Azazel.
Kind of like the Azazel, yeah. Except the Azazel wouldn't necessarily try to avoid his pain, but yeah, similar. Okay, Mishnah is chayiv skila, at least not try to avoid pain the same way we would for a human. I don't know that we want to inflict pain on the azazel, but not with the same care, I don't think, at least. Okay.
No, he was pushed backwards,
Right,
so he wouldn't defend himself.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Mishnah is chayiv skila, one who nowadays would have been liable for who violated the Torah in such an offense that had they been in the times of the temple, they would have been liable for stoning. Then Hashem is going to organize circumstances as such that the person might get that skila, that stoning, even though there's no temple and there's no court. How's that? Oh, you know, from an agag, the person might fall from a roof. Right? As we just mentioned, the death by stoning was to fall from a high platform. So God might make it that the person will fall from a roof. Or an animal might attack him. As Rashi explains, a lion might hit him with his nails and throw him to the ground. And that again is similar to the stoning of the temple. So this is what God might do to someone if they're liable for that kind of punishment. Yeah, obviously, when human beings judge, it sounds scary. The human court is no longer here. God's court is here, and therefore punishment still keeps on going. Sounds very scary. On the other hand, you can think of it in the positive light. First of all, in the times of the temple, even the court, as we've learned here a number of times, the court's job was to try to find a way to get the person out of it. And if a human being is going to do that, then certainly God would do that. And even more because a human judges can only a judge can only judge based on that which they observe. So if there's evidence and all of Torah proceedings are done in terms of how they screen the witnesses and so on and so forth, then this person is liable for capital punishment. They have to give capital punishment. They have no choice. So if they've done their due diligence and trying to find a way to get this person off, meaning the person should get this guy off scot-free, doesn't get capital punishment. But if they go through the whole proceedings and the result is the person, everything checks out, so they have to kill him. That's Torah law. They have to do that capital punishment. But Hashem is the judge who knows everything and knows the Jew's heart. And if the person does teshuvah, Hashem can accept that teshuvah. Hashem can see all the way into the heart of the Jew, whereas the human court cannot. So it's quite possible that this person did full real teshuvah, but he might end up being killed by the high court because the law was done and the law is done. And we can't see what's in his heart. The court cannot know what's in his heart. But Hashem does. And therefore Hashem might change his judgment based on all kinds of considerations that a human being cannot take into consideration. But nonetheless, it doesn't take away from the fact that it still exists. And were Hashem to decide to punish someone with skila, Hashem can find his way to do it. The example here is fall from the roof or an animal attacks him. That's for capital punishment of stoning. We'll go through the other ones in a moment.
Right, and even when the court was in session, a lot of times the person you just couldn't legally have him convicted.
That's what I'm saying.
So 90% of the time he was guilty, just couldn't convict him in
100%.
So heavenly judgment was always presumably administered to those.
I see. Okay. What you're saying is that, that's probably also true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's saying is that in the human court, there are times when a person was guilty, but because they couldn't go through all the proceedings, they didn't actually give the punishment, which is what they're supposed to do. That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to find a way to not actually give the capital punishment. So find some part of the proceeding that wasn't done properly, the warning, the witnesses, whatever it is, and get him off. And he doesn't have to be convicted. But then Hashem could have also done it too at that time. Yeah.
Presumably Hashem was administering measure for measure, even in those instances.
Presumably, yeah. Okay, so that's for the skila, the stoning, person fall from the roof or attacked by an animal. Mishin is high of serifa, one who commits a sin for which one would have been liable for death by burning. So actually, the death by burning is not that they put the person by the stake. Yeah, they don't like the what do they call it, the conde feet? What are those? There's a Latin term for this, or Italian or Spanish Italian term where they during the Inquisition where they would take bonne feet or something. I'm mispronouncing it. Someone watching this hopefully can put in the comments and tell me what it is. It's There's a description of a term where they used to take the Jewish people who would not give in to the Christian overlords, and they would literally burn them at the stake, tie them to a stick, and it was a public affair. They would come out and watch as they burnt this screaming Jew alive. That is not the way capital punishment was done for Jewish people. So death by burning was the person's inside was burnt out. So they would take hot molten lead and open up his throat as wide as they could and pour it down. It sounds very gruesome, but the person died instantaneously, essentially. Whereas Jews did not die instantaneously at the stake, suffered for literally burning. At any rate, I'm saying this because the Gemara here says that a person who is liable for capital punishment with burning, and Hashem wanted to give that measure for measure to this individual, then nafal b'dleika, he might actually fall into an actual fire. Or nachash makishoy, or a snake might bite him. And the snake is like that internal burning where the venom burns him from the inside. Okay? Mishin is chayav hariga, one who is liable, who has done a sin which during temple times they would have been liable for capital punishment via the knife. And Hashem decided that that Hashem would want to inflict that on this Jew post-temple time. Then either Hashem will arrange it that the person is taken by the local king, and that's how kings used to do killing, right, by the sword, later with guillotine, but earlier with one fell swoop of the executioner. So Hashem might cause that to happen. Or he's attacked by bandits, who again might actually kill him with a sword. Likewise, Mishin is Chayv Chanika, one who does a sin for which during temple times they would have been liable for capital punishment via strangulation, which again has its own system where they do it in such a way that it's as quick as possible. All of this, by the way, is discussed in Gemara and Sanhedrin, not the chapter we learned, but the earlier chapters.
2 layers,
two ropes, and they have it pulled from both directions that it goes very quickly, and they open up it's a whole thing.
Yeah.
And they put a cushion so it doesn't give him rope burns. Yeah. Whole proceeding. It sounds very gruesome, but all of it's done so that it's as quick as possible.
You never thought of doing it the way they slaughter an animal, by just getting the esophagus and
the knife one? I can't remember, but I think so. I can't remember. But I think so. That's as quick as possible, I think.
Yeah.
I can't remember right
Go
now.
for the jugular and the esophagus, you're finished in a second.
Yeah.
You have a hood over your head, and you don't even know when it's going to happen.
No, but the hood over the head, I don't remember. I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to comment. I don't remember.
I'm going to have a bad dream about this.
No, I mean the other ones I remembered, about the burning and the stoning, but I don't remember about the knife. I'm pretty sure. Sorry? Somehow I'm drawing a blank. Anyway, okay, so but Mishnah Chayav Chanika, one who does a sin for which they would have been liable for death by strangulation. That's the fourth of the 4 types of capital punishment. And Hashem decided that this person is deserving of that. And Oiteveh ben Nahar, either Hashem might organize circumstances that the person will drown, which is a kind of strangulation, or sarunchi, I think that's pronounced it, or the person dies by a certain type of sickness that attacks the throat. Rashi writes it in Old French, it's boom naut. Maybe the T is silent.
Choke on something.
Boom nail, but that's interesting. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say he would choke on something. He says either drowned or mespe serunchi. That's what I thought also, by the way. When I first read it, I thought for sure that's what he's going to say.
Anything that obstructs the airflow.
Yeah, but it doesn't say that. He says he's going to drown. I guess, but it's funny that he gives these 2 examples specifically. He drowns or he dies by this, Rashi calls it boom nelt. Maybe the T is silent. It's an old French word, boom nail. Some kind of sickness that attacks the throat.
It could be like an allergy, or when some people, they have an allergic reaction, their throat contracts.
Could have given him COVID.
COVID, yeah, I don't know what it is. Some sort of sickness that got to the throat, but Rashi gives a specific name for it. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. Anyway, okay. So this was Rav Yosef speaking and Rav Chia speaking, who are sages of the Gemara age. And the Gemara continues that we'll do a few more lines here. The Gemara continues that the same thing is found in the Mishnah age text. Tanya, we learned the first of the wider set of lines. Tanya, we learned Haya Rabbi Omer. Rabbi would say, Rabbi, the author, the compiler of the Mishnah, Yehuda Hanasi, Yehuda the prince. From where do we derive this idea that the measure by which man measures, that's the measure that he is measured, that God's judgment is measure for measure. Shenema, as the verse reads, Bisasa Bishalcha Terivena. Bisasa, which means with the same measure of itself, God sends. Terivena means that which afflicts. So the literal verse, I looked up the verse itself, but the verse itself, Rashi describes as talking about the Exodus from Egypt. But anyway, the way the Gemara is explaining the verse here is Bisasa. Sa, the word sa, sin samach ayin aleph hey, is a certain measure. It's a very large measure. So it's a large measure called a sa, grain. So actually, water also, like for example, the mikvah is 40 sa. That's the minimum size for a mikvah. So a sa is a measure. So bisasa, with the measure of a sa, with the measure of your own sin, bishalcha terivena, God sends the terivena, that which afflicts. So the punishment is with the same measure the person did. Now the Gemara continues, aim the elasa. Perhaps this is only when it comes to a sa, meaning a large measure. A person did a major sin, then God responds with the same kind of major retribution. And nine laraba is tarkov. Where do we know that also a tarkov, which is a smaller measure, or chatzi tarkov, a half a tarkov, which is even smaller measure, a kav, which is even smaller measure, the chatzi kav, or half a kav, which is even smaller, obviously, roiva, a quarter of a kav, the chatzi roiva, a half of a quarter, an eighth, taimon, which is even smaller measure, va'uchla, an even smaller measure. Minayin, how do we know? So how do we know that even these smaller measures Hashem also responds, right? Because the verse that we quoted uses the term sa, which is a very large measure. So how do we know that even a person who sins in a smaller scale, that God also responds in kind with a smaller scale? Maybe God overlooks it because not a big deal. So says the Gemara, the verse reads, Kikol soya sa'on berash. Every single sign and sign, every kind of measure is measured. Okay, it's a different verse. That actually, they're both from Isaiah, but different chapters. The Gemara continues. So now, okay, so we've covered the fact that Hashem responds in kind, measure for measure. And we've also covered that Hashem goes, kol sign, this sign, every type of measure Hashem responds to. So Menayin, how do we know? Shekol proto prutum tzarefes l'cheshbon gadol. That every tiny little bit adds to a great number. In other words, it's not as if a person does a small, this is where Rashi explains it. So even as Hashem responds to each small measure, nonetheless, they don't disappear. All the small measures add up and they become greater. So for example, a person does, let's say a person slips with a certain sin. Okay, so he slipped with a certain sin. And he does it again. Okay, he did it again. But then once the person does it 100 times, it's not only that he slipped 100 times, but now it's become something he doesn't care about. So now it's become bigger than, the sum has become larger than, the total has become larger than the sum, right? What's the expression? The sum total is larger than the parts. That's the expression, right? So in other words, each individual part was a part. So Hashem responded to each one part. But then when it becomes a sum total, it's kind of indicative of a greater carelessness, and therefore that too has to be responded to. So
the sum total is
greater than its parts, right? So each tiny bit is added to the great sum, making the sum greater even, thus causing for an extra response from Hashem.
Right.
Yeah.
Your character has been changed.
That's right. Exactly, because your character's been changed because you've been so careless about it. So it's not unless you slipped away a certain sin, but now it's become careless. It's become a habit.
You now have,
That's right.
It
So
happen inadvertently at this point.
That's right.
Consciously.
So a person gave in to his animal inclination once, okay, give in. Twice, okay. 3 times already. Now it's become a habit. Now it's become a habit. The Hashem's response is now even greater. So even if Hashem responded to each individual act, but now that it's become part of this greater sum, Hashem responds to that as well. This is what Rashi explains it. So Talmud Leimar comes the verse and indicates this, where there it says, Achas la'achas limtzei cheshbon, one by one they find their measure. Now, as we said, and we have to conclude with this, we said yesterday that the the measure of God's kindness is greater than the measure of God's negative. So if this is all true, that Hashem responds to large sin, and Hashem responds to small sin, and small sin combined causes another response because it's become now a habit, then certainly the same thing is true of good, and even greater. A big good act, God rewards. A small good act, God rewards too. And a bunch of small good acts that come together, Hashem rewards even greater. Specifically, this is used with the matter of tzedakah. Hakol Ufireva Maisa, the Rambam famously explains this, and the Alter Rebbe quotes this in Tanya, that when the Mishnah says that when it comes to charity, it's all about the multiple acts. Meaning to say that if a person was going to give $1 million to charity, he can give it in one fell swoop, one big check, or he can give it out, spread it out over some time. So better spread it out over time, unless, of course, the recipient needs the money right away, then obviously give it right away. But if a person could, a person should expand their giving into multiple acts. And for the same reason, that it shouldn't just be, oh, I once got inspired and gave charity, but it should become a habit where I give and give and give. And this is something that Rabbi pushed tremendously, giving charity every day. This is one of the reasons why everybody speaks about dollars, to inculcate that giving habit. Give every day. Give a little charity before Shachris, before prayer, and then the afternoon prayer. They're said to give more charity. On Friday afternoon, give twice because you can't give on Shabbos. So give now extra before Yom Tov. Give 3 times because you can't give for 2 days. Give. Even if it's a small amount, just to give, be in the habit of giving. They've been encouraged that we should have a charity box in the kitchen, because where we hang out and that's where we eat. And the kitchen is where we take for ourselves. Have a charity box there, because in the place where you're taking, you should have a giving box. And never wanted it, not just that you should have a giving box, but it should be attached to the wall. It's the physical structure of my house.
I saw a picture there of the house.
There's a stuck. That's right. There's a Tzedaka box in the kitchen, and Rebbe spoke about this, and we have one in my house as well. And Rebbe said that it should be attached to the wall in such a way that on Shabbos you're not allowed to remove it, because it's halachically speaking part of the structure of your home. So the physical home is a giving thing, right? And because it's not just about how much you give, but it's also the idea of like it says over here, kol pruta cheshbon gadol. He uses the expression pruta, which pruta just means a little bit, but the word pruta also means penny. Each penny adds up. So the language here, when he describes a small sin, is also used to describe charity. Pruta, the same word. So every act adds and adds, inculcating this habit of giving and giving and giving and giving. And when a person does it that way, it's much greater than if he gives it in one fell swoop. In fact, Rebbe began this foundation called Keren Hashana, which is called the yearly foundation. And what it does is, before the year begins, you give a certain amount of money, and then this foundation every day takes a tiny bit of the money you gave and puts it into charity for you. So that every single day you're guaranteed you gave charity. You can start with 365 cents. And they do the same thing on Shabbat. Friday afternoon, they'll give twice, one for Friday, one for Shabbos. Before Yom Tov, they'll give 3 times for the 2 days of Yom Tov, and so on. So that every day there's charity given on your behalf. So you can start with 365 cents to $350,000, and they'll put $1,000 a day, right? But the point is, not just the amount you give, but also kol pruto putum stefes cheshbon gadol. Every single bit becomes, the sum total becomes greater than the parts. But the sum total becomes greater than the parts because you did it in parts. Had I given $1 million, it's only $1 million. But now that the $1 million is broken up to a bunch of parts, now the $1 million is much greater, because the $1 million is not just money I gave once on inspiration, but it's money that I've given out of a habit because I'm a giving person, and I've given it every single day, right? So by breaking it up into parts, now the sum total becomes even greater. And of course, I'm using this as a mirror, because the Gemara is talking about this in the negative. But we have the principle that God's measure of good is greater than the measure for negative. Then if I take everything it says here about the negative, that whenever there's a negative behavior, there's a punishment from Hashem, and I put it in the mirror and amplify it, that's the way I see how Hashem provides for the good. So when we have here the Gemara giving us this very harsh description of Hashem giving punishments of capital punishment and Hashem collecting every single sin to make it to a larger sum, and certainly all of this exists in greater measure for the positive. A wonderful day and a good Erev Shabbos.
You too.
Okay. Have a good Shabbos, Alan.
You too.